Well, good morning. I need to ask your forgiveness up front. I don't get nervous to do this. What I get nervous by is knowing that I have less time than I thought I had. And because of things that we were very, very insistent upon including in our time together this morning, I have less time than I normally have. So I will do my best. I don't know what that means. So, my name's David, by the way, if you're new. I know we have a couple new people here, so saw you when you came in. So, one of the things I get to do here is something called reclamation. I tell everyone who comes to reclamation, like the first 10 minutes or so, is basically just a litany of disclaimers. And those disclaimers have to happen for a few reasons. One, reclamation is a little bit different, programmatically, than anything else we do. I talk a lot in it, whereas most of our other programming, we tried to make very discussion-oriented and discussion-driven, allow y'all to talk to each other, which is great. This is a little bit more teachy. And so I want to make sure people understand what they just walked into. And then the second, at least the second, there's probably more than two, but the second one that comes to mind that I think is important for people to understand is, in that space, to use an expression, let my hair down a little bit. Maybe more than I do up here on a Sunday morning. And all that really means is I give myself a little bit more free rein to rabbit trail, to make obscure references. And some of you are probably, who've heard me on Sunday before, probably sitting here thinking, there's a more of this version? Never signing up for that class. But another thing I tell everyone is that and this is going to sound weird coming from a pastor type, but I do reclamation for me. And here's what I mean by that. I am thrilled that people come to it and continue to come to it and that we always have a good time, I hope. I have a good time. But I do it for me because I have always, I'll put it this way, my way of worshiping God is thinking deeply, having my ideas stretched and challenged, and just almost marveling at the new ideas around the divine that I can explore. And in my experience, that isn't always available at churches, believe it or not. Actually, it's been a massive frustration of mine working at churches for almost 15 years now. Is first time I ever started at a church, I was like, all right, this is great. So all these people, all they're gonna want to do, all my coworkers, we're just gonna talk about God and nerdy theology stuff all the time. Nope. No one wants to do that. So it fortunately other places exist, like the internet, but the internet place sucks. Twitter, I lived on Twitter for a while. That was bad. Reddit, and don't go there. So I created this little haven for myself called Reclamation. And so do come check it out sometime if you haven't. We're about halfway through right now. The current session, there'll be another one in the very near future. But one of the things that I love about Reclamation is I get to maybe explore ideas that in maybe earlier stages of my faith journey didn't really make a ton of sense to me, or don't work anymore in the way that they used to work. A big one, for example, is prayer. Never been really into that sort of thing, and many of you probably know if you've heard me speak on stage, sometimes I kind of Irish goodbye at the end. Instead of praying, it's just kind of oh, cool, grace and peace, see ya. That's going to happen today. But in the last reclamation, I got to explore prayer and sort of share what that has come to mean for me in a reclaimed way, because that's what it's for. It's for going back and finding new life, new sense of meaning in some of these things that maybe used to mean something to us and don't anymore, sometimes for really traumatic reasons. And so one of my favorite things, this is all kind of building to this moment, one of my favorite things to reclaim, probably the thing that I most love to reclaim, is sin. And that can surprise some people. One, I mean, it's fun to say that, ooh, yeah, let's reclaim sin, make that awesome again. But that's not what I mean by it. Well, I'll put it this way. Churches like Watershed, welcome to Watershed. Churches like Watershed, churches that are, maybe a little bit more progressive, churches that are wrestling with oftentimes the ways in which our faith hasn't worked. And maybe you're showing up here, maybe some of us are showing up here, and this is kind of like it. I actually, when my wife and I first moved here, we were attending another church, not like long term, but like we went with some friends of ours to another church, and I kid you not, as we were walking out, my wife said we were going to be going to Watershed for the very first time a few days later. We knew that. We were hopeful that Watershed would end up being our home. But she said, hey, if it doesn't work out with this Watershed place, I think I need a break, like from organized religion, from church. We never left, so that's good. But yeah, so when it comes to sin, I do often think that a church like this doesn't really know what to do with that precisely because I think for many of us, sin is one of those things that was weaponized. Sin was weaponized. It was a concept that made us feel estranged from ourselves. Certain faith traditions frame sin as this thing that almost makes us toxic at the level of our very being, toxic to ourselves, toxic to one another, and maybe most traumatically toxic to God. And so oftentimes when people come to a place like Watershed, or at least leave previous experiences, there's a sense in which, well, that doesn't work anymore, and we don't actually need to do anything with that idea anymore. And that can be inconvenient at times when, kind of some of the stuff that we're talking about this morning, that you've already heard this morning, some of the lyrics of that last song Austin played, like when we're wrestling with injustice, when we're wrestling with evil that we see in the world, systemic issues of marginalization and harm and things like that. So oftentimes maybe we can go far enough as to understand what sin could mean, maybe systemically at the level of politics and things like that. But on the personal level, I don't know, not something either that we have use for anymore, or not something that we know how to have use for anymore, right? And so, but I love it. And part of the reason I love it is because the way I've come to understand it, and I think I can track this back to the Bible, to the words of Paul especially, but the way that I've come to understand it is it's different. It's different than the way that I grew up, and in the, oh my gosh, little amount of time that I have left, I'm going to do my best to sort of walk you through what has come to make sense for me around this idea that for many of us is probably not something that we're even wanting to reclaim, if that's fair. So let me toss a verse up here. It's a verse in Hebrews 9:22, I believe. It says this: in fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Good luck, me. I say that because I think some of the imagery that many of us recoil against based on our upbringing is often the bloody, sacrificial language, the notion that for God to love us, there needs to be some sort of bloody sacrifice, as if, God is, some sort of vampire or something like that, and needs to consume our blood, and then we consume his, and you get all this imagery around things like communion and Eucharist and things like that. If I'm being completely honest, a lot of the work we do here is to try to try to, in many ways, reclaim a picture of who God is outside of that more judgmental, violent even, imagery that many of us are raised with. So to choose this verse was a little provocative on my part, and also a little wanting to spare you all from me just doing Genesis 3 again, which is, I feel like I've done that 17 straight times. Maybe you don't feel that way. I feel that way. So the first thing I want you to think about, or want you to do when it comes to this verse, is we're going to substitute the word blood or shedding with blood just with a more general word, sacrifice, okay? And the reason for that is in context, in the context of what's going on here, whatever the author of Hebrews is doing, the blood and the sacrificial language, all of that was very normal back then for them, both within the Jewish tradition, but also within many of the neighboring or competing religious traditions. So whereas that might be a little jarring for us, it wasn't jarring for them, but conceptually, the most important thing to take away here is the notion of sacrifice, something of value, being let go of, being sacrificed, and it is that act of sacrifice that creates a kind of wholeness, which is what forgiveness is. It's a kind of wholeness where previously there was a lack. Okay, so with that substitution made, we're going to leave the verse up for a second. Yeah, you can just leave it up, and I'm going to take a detour, which is something I'm really good at, detour. So you've probably noticed if you've been here long enough. If you haven't, just a little heads up about Watershed. I'm not the person talking all the time. It's another reason I do reclamation, so then I can be the person talking all the time. But I'm not the person talking all the time. Sometimes Matt, who you met this morning, is talking. Sometimes the incredibly famous Kim Honeycutt. I was told last week that I don't associate Kim amongst the people I know who are famous quite explicitly enough, so that was just a personal shout out for her. Sometimes it's Blair, our family pastor. Sometimes it's Cedric. Sometimes it's Sean. We have a teaching team here, and I love that. I love that for a few reasons. One, because all of y'all are different. Your stories are different. What you need is different. Some of you are visual learners. I'm probably not your favorite, if that's the case, because I'm not good at slides. Some of you all are narrative learners. You learn from story. Also probably not your favorite as well. But some of you are like me. You like to nerd out on all the deep conceptual stuff. That's why I'm here. And because I have a team around me, I don't feel beholden to try to meet all of y'all where you're at. As well, I'm going to try, of course, but I know that, what I can't be for you, Kim can, or Sean can, or Cedric can, and so I love it, and it's incredibly freeing just to have that team around us. That actually wasn't the detour. That was a detour from the detour. Where I was actually going was to say that all of us on this teaching team, and I kind of already alluded to this, we have different ways that we connect personally. Some of us tell stories talking about our childhoods or our mothers. Kim, for example, she's like a brilliant expert psychotherapist, so she gets to bring in that expertise. Sean is this incredible poet, and so that factors into her story. For me, I kind of have these two niche lanes that I focus on. One is just general nerd stuff. So I was actually asked by a friend of mine like 20 minutes ago, like, how many Lord of the Rings references do you think you can fit into this sermon? I said, I don't know. I don't really write it down beforehand. So as the Spirit leads, I guess, we'll see. I'm counting this as one, Graham. So at least one so far. So yeah, nerd stuff, nerd references. And I know that works for some of you because you come up and you tell me about it. But then the other thing, and this is probably the far more relatable thing, is really, really niche, French and German philosophy, which I know is just the thing everyone's really into. So this is a detour, but it will get to the destination. Here's where it's going. So when it comes to that concept of sacrifice, all right? Sacrifice, sin, these things go together. The idea of sin is there's been some sort of wrong inflicted, some sort of debt needs to be paid. The sacrifice is the currency, the exchange that pays the debt. Okay, this is kind of how we think about it. I know, half the Easter sermons that I ever witnessed growing up, the big dramatic moment where the pastor and the band's already playing behind them to set the mood and stuff like that, which actually, I kind of love when they do that. It makes me get a little hyped. But, and kind of the big dramatic moment is forgiveness means paid in full. But what I want to complicate this morning is that as a notion of forgiveness, that as a notion of salvation, and to be honest, that as a notion of sin. And so here's where the obscure French philosophy comes in. There's this dude, he was actually kind of a jerk in real life, but I thought he had some really good ideas. His name's Jacques Lacan. He's a French psychoanalyst and philosopher. And the way that he sort of explained the human psyche, it really orbits around this idea called lack. And here's all that lack is. Lack simply is the name for that sense within us that if only I could fill in the blank, I would be made whole. And we all have different versions of this. We have things that we desire, things that we aspire towards, things that we think, if I could only get that job, be with this person, hit this tax bracket, eat that meal, fill in the blank, have that experience. And it's probably not any one thing. In fact, many of these things that we are consciously desiring towards, consciously seeking, are actually almost standing in as a representative for something that's probably more unconscious, more fundamental, that we think if this hole in our being could only be filled, so then we'll be whole, then we'll be saved. And 99% of the time, we're attempting to save ourselves, all right? I think I said this a few weeks ago in a previous talk, but that's kind of how I explain the Enneagram. For those of you who are familiar with the Enneagram, it's sort of like a personality profile thing, but the best way to understand your Enneagram number is your number corresponds with the thing that you desire that you think is going to make you whole. So for a 3, it'd be success. For a 4, it'd be like recognition. For a 1, it would be everything being correct. For a 5, it's knowledge, it's competency. I think if only I can have enough information, then I'll actually be useful. I'll be competent enough to be needed. People keep me around. Not true, turns out. But here's the thing, that's not true for any of them. And the curse of the Enneagram, or anything like this potentially, is, it's bad if you don't get the thing that you think is going to make you whole, but it's worse if you get it. Because then if you don't get it, then there's sort of a depressive state where, you're longing after this almost to the point of obsession at times. But then if you get it, well, sometimes that melancholy is worse because it didn't save you. It didn't make you whole. And so for the Enneagram, for example, if I had all the knowledge of the world, if I became like the human ChatGPT, then some of you have that thing I called the internet. It wouldn't. I would still feel this lack. Okay. If anything, I'd be even more frustrated, more angry. And the trick then, and this sort of gets to the end game, but I'm going to say it now, is the trick is, if I can get to the place where I can make peace with the fact that this isn't going to save me, in my case, it's competency or knowledge. In your case, it's you probably have a sense of it. Then actually that thing, I don't entirely die to it. I die to it, but then it returns to me, resurrection. It returns to me as a kind of gift, which I can then steward freely, not as a means to an end, kind of like the song, but but as simply a blessing of abundance that I can share with the people around me. So this idea of lack that the cool kind of angry French guy, Jacques Lacan, sort of theorized around, lack is how I've come to understand sin. All right, and I said I wasn't going to reference Genesis 3, but I actually am. So in the Genesis 3 narrative, which most of you are familiar with, whether you've opened a Bible or not, that is the part of the story where, Adam and Eve are chilling in the buff, and in comes this snake, and the snake is like, yo, why don't you eat that fruit? And Eve's like, well, we're not supposed to, because that fruit will kill us. And the snake's like, I'm paraphrasing, but the snake's like, no, God's lying to you. If you eat that fruit, you'll be like God. And what does the snake say is to be like God is to have the knowledge of good and evil. And that's really, really key, because the way that the snake frames this, the way that the serpent frames it, this whole idea of equating the knowledge of good and evil, this binary notion of in, out, right, wrong, pure, impure, messy, clean, fill in your binary example, equating that with the divine, with infinity, with wholeness, is, I think, the fundamental lie at the root of all of this that I think we need to address. Because if that's true, then the only way to be made whole is to go about, the whole desire loop that I was just talking about. I just need to get what's good. And if I can just get everything organized the right way, good over here, bad out there, then I will be whole, be made like God. I'll be saved. And we have a million versions of that. Our entire economic system is predicated on this being incredibly sticky and difficult for us to, not only difficult, impossible for us to ever overcome. There's always more. This ideology of promise that we're always seeking after. But here's a few things to remember about Genesis 3. One, we already know, per the earlier part of the narrative, that Adam and Eve, standing in this instance for all of humanity, that humanity is already made in the image of God. Which means that sense of desire, that sense of lack that the serpent was, per the story, sort of feeding into, was already there. All that changed was their relationship to it. All right? So within the nerdy French guy, Lacan, hopefully you're still with me, but if not, I'm just going to keep plowing ahead. Within Lacan's framework, lack is this dialectical, it's this paradoxical thing. Lack is always both a lack and an excess. And for Lacan, and I won't bore you with too many of these details, the way that this works is it manifests in language. And think about our words, think about our language. Every word that we use is simultaneously, I kid you not, you could probably go through every word both in our language and any other language. Language is always both too much and too little. Any word there's always more that could be said and not enough said. Even your name. If someone says your name, immediately there's associations with that. You know, there is your entire experienced history and others' history experience of you, like having experienced you. And your name both says too much and not enough on that front. And that's true of any other word, all right? So this notion of lack, it's also an excess. But the moment that we speak, the moment that we say something, I don't know, something like, let there be light. Something like, let's make humanity in our image. There is both not enough said and too much said. You see, this notion of lack, yeah, from the perspective of the serpent and pretty much all of humanity, you know, after that part of the story, we experience as this void, this emptiness that needs to be filled if we're going to be saved, if we're going to be made whole, if we're going to be useful, meaningful. But all we have to do is shift our perspective just a little bit here, and rather than some sort of deficit, rather than some sort of curse upon us, this lack, which is also an infinite excess, an infinite more, a wellspring of possibility, is in fact, and has from the beginning, been the very image of God within us. So what we experience as lack and buy into this notion that if only fill in the blank, we will be made whole, which is exactly how that notion of the ends justifies the means takes hold. Rather than seeing it as that, if we see this longing, this yearning, this drive within us, not as something to be disavowed and overcome, but something to be embraced because it is God's creative potential welling up from within us, something that is not to be owned so that we can lord it over others, but something that is to be stewarded and shared in all of the vulnerability that comes with that. Well, that's a game changer. At least it has been for me. So just to recap real quick. So rather than seeing or experiencing this lack as something to be overcome, we can embrace it as God's infinite creative potential within us. That doesn't mean it's never gonna stop being agitating in that sense, because there's always new possibility. You know, anytime that we open our mouths to speak, just like when God opened God's mouth to speak, simultaneously there's always more and less that could be said. It's to be honest, it actually mirrors the way that the entire universe works, whether you go down to the quantum level or all the way up to the cosmic level, and you think about how stars are born. You know, there's like the splitting and the fusion of all these atoms, and it scales. This sort of same logic goes down to things that we can't possibly even comprehend at the tiniest level and things so beyond our comprehension at the largest level. That same logic maps to us. That's the divine. So what do we do with this? All right. We talk a lot about vulnerability here at Watershed. To embrace this lack, to embrace this part of us that is always, it sometimes is experienced like a void, but at other times is bursting out in new and unexpected ways. Well, it creates a kind of vulnerability. Because our entire society is sort of organized or built around this idea that if we can just, fill in the blank, if we can just adhere to some certain sort of sense of normativity, some sort of agreed upon set of values as to what, being right, being normal, being what's successful, being included looks like, then we're going to be good. And so on some level, and maybe you've heard this in the words of Jesus or the words of Paul before. On some level, to embrace what I'm talking about requires a kind of death, a kind of sacrifice of self, which, of course, then brings us back to our passage in Hebrews. Here's the thing. The relationship that we have with this idea of lack, with this divinity within us, is always going to require sacrifice. It's built into it, because if you go all the way back to the creation narrative, the creation story, as God is speaking the world into existence, God is essentially speaking God's self, but how can you ever say enough to capture the divine? So there's always more, and so there's this self-emptying aspect of God's, creative power. And so when we are bearing God's image, ourselves also creating with our hands and with our words and with the way that we are together, all of us together, there's a certain sense of loss and there's a certain sense of sacrifice just built into that. And so we can either sacrifice the people around us as we seek to overcome that, or we can embrace that kind of existential, kind of psychic sacrifice within us, and do what Jesus was talking about when he talks about, dying to self. Do what Paul embody what Paul was talking about when he said things like, I desire to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Basically assenting to, agreeing to, embracing, use whatever metaphor you want, the idea that whatever God is, whatever we mean by God, it doesn't necessarily look like this thing that's going to, fit us into this box where, we were at maybe 60% of the box, and then now we've got the other missing 40%, and now we're this whole box. Because the problem with boxes is they're finite. You are not. We are not. God is not. And so to ever think that some notion of God, or honestly, more often, something that we achieve or do ourselves is going to fill the box, is to accept the lie that all we are these finite things and we can fit in a box. And here's the reality. We can try that all we want, but there's going to be these little cracks. And out of that crack is going to be the mess of your infinity, the mess of your divinity. It's gonna break out whether you like it or not. And so that can either feel traumatizing, and as you almost picture like trying to hold a bouncy ball or a volleyball, like a dodgeball, like under a pool. Like you can struggle with it, you can try, but it's gonna burst out. And if you do it like, kind of haphazardly like this, have you ever, it's burst out and it's like hit you right in the face? Embarrassing. Or you can kind of just let it out. Let it float where it's going to float. It's going to feel really vulnerable. You're going to feel exposed. But here's the cool thing. And here's to kind of bring it full circle, to kind of put a pin in it. Here's where it sort of reclaims the notion of sin for me. There's two sides to this sin thing, all right? There's two sides to this sin thing. On the one side, we have that sense of lack. Maybe we'll call that original sin. Take that, Augustine. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's not actually a deficit. It's all of us are just God saying God's own name over and over again. And there's always more to be said. So you embrace that. But then the other side of sin is us trying to disavow that. And when we try to disavow it or overcome it, we hurt ourselves and we hurt the people around us. So to avoid doing that, we embrace this other part, the messiness, the possibility, the ways that things don't fit in a box. We don't fit in a box. All right. And that will radically change the way that we think of belonging. Let me be super practical. Everyone belongs, okay? The snake was wrong, so he got cursed. Sucks for the snake. But the good news is the snake was wrong, all right? So everyone belongs, but how does everyone belong? We all belong precisely because none of us belong. Because on some level, belonging is this binary thing. In order to understand that there's an in, there has to be an out. But if there's no place to be in or out of, because there is too much of us, too much God, too much everything beautiful about that within us, there wouldn't be a place to put it anyway. It wouldn't fit. We don't fit. So all of us together get to be our beautiful, divine, messy selves by embracing the very thing that God revealed in Christ. None of us belong. And it's the one thing that we all get to do together. So my prayer for you this week, yes, I do pray a little. My prayer for you this week is as you go out and you see the people that you have to interact with, like, there's going to be this longing, this desire to overcome that. But there's nothing to overcome. You're good. You belong. And so does everyone else. Precisely because none of us do and never will. And that's really, really good news. As promised, grace and peace.